people. We're up here in the vinyl attic for another episode of Vinyl Fetish. We're going to take a little break from our normal discussion of albums since we're still in the grips of the new Beatlemania. Now and then, as a number one hit around the world, here in the U.S., it debuted at number 7 on the Billboard singles chart, right below a debut from some guy from BTS. Because K-pop is the new Beatlemania, they tell me. And Cozy's still singing it, and people are still reviewing it, and it's certainly still brought the world's attention back to the Beatles. So what I thought I'd do is tell some stories. My life has sort of been shaped by my obsession with the Beatles, including when I was 18 going off to school in London to be closer to all things John, Paul, George, and Ringo, including going to Liverpool and getting my hair cut at the barbershop in Penny Lane and all that silly stuff. So I wanted to tell some stories about John, Paul, George, and Ringo in reverse order, including their kids. Just quick little stories that shine some light into their character. I'll start with Ringo. I've never met any of Ringo's children, but I've certainly seen Zach play drums many times with Ringo, and especially with The Who. And Ringo had a really great bunch of albums that were produced by Mark Hudson from the Hudson Brothers, who I loved when I was a little kid. And one of them was a 2003 album, Ringo Rama, that had this kind of metally song called Instant Amnesia. It's just a kick-ass song that you wouldn't expect from Ringo, especially if you think about his late 70s Ringo the Fourth and Bad Boy records and all that dreck that he was doing. It's a really solid rock record. And I was in Santa Monica one day, and all the stories sort of came together. I'd seen Ringo on tour in something called the Brit Festival, which is in Southern Oregon, in Ashland, Oregon. And, his fans are mostly older, and they want to hear Yellow Submarine and maybe Photograph and things like that. And he was sort of hemming and hawing that he had this new record out called Ringo Rama, and I just shouted out, "Instant Amnesia!" because I love that song so much, and Ringo just looked right at me and said, "Thank you, brother." He didn't play that one. He played the single off the album. But a few months later, I was walking down the street in Santa Monica, on Santa Monica Boulevard in Los Angeles, and I ran into Mark Hudson and Steve Dudas, who's the guitarist player on that record. He does all the great guitar solos on that song. And I stopped them, and I'm like, "You guys, what are you doing?" And they were actually... He was sort of finishing up with his work with Ringo at that point, and I talked about, that song and yelling it out to Ringo, and they really got a kick out of the fact that, there was someone who just loved that song so much that they would interrupt a Ringo Starr concert to shout it out. And about a year later, I was at a Beatle Fest in Las Vegas, and I ran into Mark Hudson again, and we got to take a picture together, and I remind him that I was the guy that stopped him in Santa Monica. That's about as close as I've gotten to Ringo. So that's my quick Ringo story. George, the George story is a little interesting. I have met Danny Harrison. We bumped into each other in a restaurant in Portland called Mother's one day. We had a great conversation just about his music. And when I was going to school in Britain, and then I started going back to London every year, I met a really great Beatle fan in front of Paul McCartney's house named Nicola Bown, who I've been trying to find ever since. Nick, if you ever see this, please find me. And we decided to go to Henley-on-Thames, where George lived. George has his Cracker Box Palace, his mansion there, and let's make the trek up to Henley-on-Thames and see if we can catch a glimpse of the Quiet One, the Quiet Beatle. And so we went with a friend of hers from Amsterdam, and we'd been there before. This was not the first time I've been to George's house. You got to go and take pictures. It's just the guardhouse in front of his property looks like the architecture of the Cracker Box Palace. But we decided we wanted to see it. We came all this way. We took the train up to Henley, and we wanted to see the house. So we decided that we were going to circle a big giant wall around it, as you would guess, for a Beatle living in a sort of a palatial English estate. And we decided we were going to go all the way around the walls, just in the bramble and the bushes and the briars and the trees and everything, until we could find a spot where we could at least see part of the house or see part of George's gardens. And so we went all the way around it, all the way around George's house and came back to the other side. This is in 1983, by the way. That was 40 years ago. I was a 19-year-old idiot. And never really got to see the house. Got to see some of the tops of some of the buildings, but never got to see the house. Certainly never got to see George. And then we went and had a beer at a pub that he's been known to hang out. Didn't see George at the pub. But, I reflect on that sort of silliness later when, in 1999, a fan did climb the wall and attack George and nearly killed him, and probably was responsible for the return of his cancer. So I kind of think how stupid that maneuver was. But I was very close to George. He was probably, the rumor was he was living in Australia. He was spending time in Hawaii and time in Australia, and the story was he was worried about Thatcher and Reagan and nuclear war and wanted to keep his son away from a place that might get bombed, and so was living on an island somewhere, living in Australia, and wasn't even there. It was right after Gone Troppo had come out, and so he was just sort of the tropical George of the early 80s. So that's my George story. Sorry, George, about that. We love you. With regards to Paul, I got many Paul stories. I got so many Paul stories, and I'll share some quick ones with you. The favorite one is when I was going to school in London. Paul bought a house around, I think, 1966, close to Abbey Road Studios, just around the corner on Cavendish Avenue, and it's sort of well known, and it's well known to fans. In fact, the song "She Came In Through the Bathroom Window" is about a fan who was climbing in through his bathroom window, and so you would often hang out in front of Paul's house, hoping to catch a glimpse of him or Linda. And I had met James, by the way. I met James McCartney at a show at Mississippi Studios here. Very quiet. We didn't take any pictures. He was very, very quiet. Had a show that probably 20 people showed up to. So it was nice to meet him. But Paul, this is, when James was just a little kid. And I was standing in front of his house one day. And this is 1982. And I noticed, I'd met this fan, I think he was from Sweden or somewhere. On his front step, there was a hefty bag of garbage. And we were thinking, God, there's a bag of Paul McCartney's garbage just sitting there. It doesn't seem like anybody's home, because he had a place on the South Coast, which is where the Beatles recorded, and he had a place in Scotland, and he spent a lot of time in the United States, and it just didn't seem like anybody's home. And so we looked at each other and we were like, we got to do it. So we scaled the wall, grabbed the hefty bag of garbage off of Paul's steps, and then like squirrels gathering their nuts, we ran around the corner, opened up the bag, and divided the booty. And there was, there's things like tea bags, but I got Linda's shopping list. I got some fan art. I got an invitation to Julian Lennon's 18th birthday. I mean, I got some really good stuff that's stashed in my attic somewhere. And of course, again, in the wake of what happened with George especially, I kind of felt bad about that. But once we kind of divided the stuff up and we realized nobody's home, we went back to the house, scaled the wall again, and then spent a good half an hour hanging out in Paul McCartney's backyard. I saw the gazebo where there's a picture of the Beatles from '68 with Martha. It's kind of a famous picture of the Beatles. I took a picture sitting on the bench where Paul told the reporter that he had taken LSD, and then left, and then have been telling that story ever since. But my favorite, actually coming into contact with Paul was about 10 years ago. He was doing a big show in Seattle, a big concert, this never-ending Paul McCartney tour. And we had taken the train, Andy and I had taken the train up there, and we were having drinks very close to the stadium where we were about to go see the show. We were pre-funking. I think it was McCormick and Schmidt's. And just having a good time. And I'll just say, when I was at Beatlefest, I got to see Pete Best talk, and Pete Best really impressed me about how much grace he has with regard to being kicked out of the Beatles, and also how he really would just love to hear from them. He's like, Paul and I are, we're old friends, and I never hear from them. We could, talk to each other about our grandkids, and it really just sort of broke my heart. And I had this thing, if I ever were to ask Paul McCartney one thing, I would be like, would you do me a favor and call Pete Best and just say hello? This became sort of my mission. So we're sitting there in the bar having drinks, and I see these police motorcycles come down the street, and my Beatles sense immediately went off, and I'm like, that can only be Paul. It can only be the Paul's heading towards the stadium. So I stood up, and Andy will tell you that I pushed her out of the way. I don't think that's true, but it may have been. I had several whiskey gingers, so it's possible. I ran out in the street, and there was a limo coming, and of course, with the window down, Paul McCartney is right there. He's just right there. He's just hanging out the window. He loves the adulation, just waving at people like he's the Queen of England. And I just ran up to him. I said, Paul, I'm going to see you in a little bit. And he looked right at me. And then I said, and then my intent was to say, call Pete Best. I just wanted to say that. Call Pete Best. But according to witnesses, I said, call Pete Buck, who is the guitarist of REM, old friend of mine, happens to live in Seattle. And Paul just looked at me like, what? And I was like, I think I said Pete Best, but I was told I said Pete Buck. In which case, the next time I saw Pete Buck, I said, if you get a call from Paul McCartney, this is why. I love that moment with Paul because he just loves the adulation. He loves his fans and how his fans sort of prop him up. It was really great. And James was a nice kid too. I enjoyed meeting James. Okay, now we move to John. This is a shirt that Andy got for me last year when she was in Mexico City. She found a really cool Beatle shop in Mexico City, and she brought this back for me. I have met Sean a couple of times at shows, and I could do a whole nother video about my experiences with Yoko Ono, who I'm glad is still on this earth, that we get to share the world with her. Sean is always really cool, always fun to talk to. And I've never met John. I mean, my senior year, the fall of 1980, when and this could be another video too, when Double Fantasy came out, my friend Ed and I hatched a plan that after our high school graduation, the spring of 81, we were going to go to New York and meet John Lennon. That was the plan, because apparently he's just walking around Central Park, and you can just walk up to him and say hi and get an autograph. And we had this whole plan to go to New York after graduation. And of course, on December 8th, that dream was taken away from all of us. And so I've never got to meet him, but I have spent some time outside of the Dakota. I had this one great experience where it was the 20th anniversary of his death in 2000. And it was just sort of, I'm getting a lump in my throat when I'm talking about it. There's this sort of throng of people in New York City there in Central Park, in the little area that was created called Strawberry Fields, which is a great little area. And everybody was singing. All the fans were there. The people sort of dressed like John. I look up in the window of the Dakota, and Yoko put a candle in the window. Like, we saw her hands. We didn't see her face, but we saw sort of her hands put the candle in the window. And I had something happened, which was something that I've shared with my students many times, which is, it's a crowd, it's cold, John Lennon, it's New York. This is when Giuliani was the mayor, Rudy Giuliani, whatever happened to that guy. There was some pot being passed around, because, the story is Dylan turned Lennon onto the pot, and Lennon turned the Beatles onto pot, and then the Beatles turned the world onto pot. So I don't really like to smoke pot, but it was for John. So I took a drag, passed it on, and immediately I get a tap on the shoulder, and I turn around, and it's a New York cop, and he's like, "Come with me." And I'm freaking out. First of all, I'm not a good pot smoker, so the thing I did is I immediately didn't exhale it. So I'm holding this pot smoke in my lungs while this cop is reading me the riot act, telling me that, I'm going to be arrested in Giuliani's zero tolerance drug state. And then I said to him, but it was for John Lennon, goo goo gajoob. Because we were singing I Am the Walrus, and the pot smoke just went right into the cop's face. And I was like, oh. And then I started doing what I like to call my white man privilege dance. I started talking about how I work with police. I'm from Oregon. It's not a big deal. And it's John Lennon, and I don't smoke pot, and I'm more of a whiskey. I did all that kind of stuff. And he let me go. Said, I don't want you to be in the park, or I'm going to kick you out of Central Park. So I walk out, and I'm kind of baked at this point. I'm like, I came 3,000 miles to be here with all these John Lennon fans. So I go around the corner, and I bought a hat from a guy in the street that was selling stocking caps. I'm thinking, he'll never know it's me. And I just walked right back into the crowd, thinking, that cop will never know that I'm the exact same person, just with a hat on. And my friend, who was the one who had handed me the joint that she received, said, "You're so lucky." And I'm like, I know I'm lucky. And she said, "No, there's the cop." And the cop was arresting a young African-American guy who had probably had the same joint that I had, because that's how things work in Giuliani's New York. White guy gets a break, black guy goes to Rikers. And I just thought about how John would have been so angry about that injustice happening there in his name. So all those are sort of little bits and pieces of stories. There are plenty more, let me tell you. There are plenty more, and I'll share some later on. But I just, as we're in this Beatle moment, wanted to take a moment to make a video about my stories with John, my life with John, Paul, George, and Ringo and their kin. All right, more vinyl coming up. We'd really love people to subscribe. We're getting really close to 1,000 subscriptions, so it'd be really great if you subscribed, so we can make a lot more of these videos. And we'll be back with more Beatles and other vinyl discussions coming soon. The Beatles matter again. You matter. Peace on Earth matters. Let's talk about it.